All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to thank everyone who is joining us today. Welcome to today's CNCF webinar, PaaS versus KaaS, what's the difference and when does it matter? I'm Taylor Wagner, and the Operations Analyst for CNCF, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. We would like to welcome our presenter, Nick Chase, Head of Technical Content at Mirantis. Hi Nick, a few housekeeping items before we get started. During the webinar, you are not able to talk as an attendee. There's a Q&A box located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please feel free to drop in your questions there rather than the Zoom chat window, and we'll get to as many as we can towards the end. With that, I'll hand it over to Nick to kick off today's presentation.
Hello, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. If you could give us the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so a little bit about me. I am in charge of technical content for Mirantis, which means that I write about this stuff for a living. And I've been getting pretty deep into this topic lately. I'm also a former member of the Kubernetes release team, and I'm an old-time developer and the author of a bunch of books and a slew of tutorials and a bunch of stuff. And let's be realistic, you didn't come here to find out about me. So let's just kind of jump right into the topic. Next slide, please. Okay, so before we start, let's take a quick look at what it is we're going to cover. We're going to start out by talking about what a platform as a service and a Kubernetes as a service actually are, so that we can kind of make sure we're all on the same page, so to speak. And then we'll look at what each one of them does well and also not so well. Finally, we'll look at some of the things that you need to ask yourself before deciding which one is going to be best for you. Next slide, please. All right, so quick word about who I had in mind when I was putting this together. It's geared towards helping make technical decisions, but it's not necessarily laden with a bunch of technical terms and concepts. That said, if you are technical, you shouldn't be bored, because these are things that you need to think about as well. Finally, if you're just curious about what this is all about, this presentation is going to help you understand the lay of the land so that you can figure out where you want to go next when it comes to getting more information. I just want to make sure here for one moment though. Yeah, okay, that was just my view. That was weird. Okay. All right. So I'm going to be talking about PaaS and KaaS in general. And of course, every product has different capabilities. So one thing that you might find helpful is to download a table that we've put together of where different KaaS and PaaS products stand when it comes to each of these capabilities. And to be honest, a bunch more capabilities that I'm not going to have time to cover. So feel free to go ahead and grab that. It will give you a whole wealth of information. All right, so let's get started. The first thing that we need to do is settle on what it is we are actually talking about. Now, it's really easy to get confused because there are PaaSes that work with Kubernetes and there are KaaSes that offer application catalogs. So it's really kind of a fluid thing, but let's go ahead and try and draw a line. Now, if you've been around for a while, this kind of progression may look familiar to you. In the old days, like 5 years ago, we had to distinguish between IaaS, or infrastructure as a service, and PaaS, or platform as a service, and SaaS, or software as a service. Now, IaaS is a system that lets developers and other users request infrastructure such as compute power and storage in a self-service way. Some examples of that include Amazon Web Services, Google Compute Engine, or on the private cloud side, OpenStack. Now with IaaS, the user generally doesn't care about the underlying hardware as long as they have the resources they need, and then they build on top of that. So they might instantiate a Ubuntu server with the block storage volume and then go ahead and install a database and a web server on top of that so that they can do what they need to do. Now, one level up from that is PaaS, or Platform as a Service, which lets developers and other users go ahead and provision components such as databases and web servers, which they would be doing anyway, and they'll use that to build their applications. But PaaS assumes that the user isn't particularly concerned with the raw compute and storage and networking, as long as they have the pieces parts that they need. Now, obviously, that's where we're going to spend time today. Now, above that is SaaS, or Software as a Service, where users don't actually stuff. They just use the application as it's provided to them. You know, for example, Salesforce is probably the best known SaaS, but really, you know, virtually any website these days is also a SaaS when you come right down to it. So that's what we used to look at. Now things are a little bit more complicated. So KaaS, or Kubernetes as a Service, is a kind of hybrid of these systems. It's at a higher level of abstraction than IaaS, but it's at a lower level of abstraction than PaaS. Now, users still aren't worried about hardware, and they're not really worried about virtual machines and so on, but they also aren't expecting full-blown application components. Next slide, please. So let's do a definition here. So Platform as a Service. It is a system that abstracts away the hardware and software deployment, and it enables developers to just mix and match components for application creation. Now, this is not the same as like low code or no code environments, if you're familiar with those. If you're not, don't worry about it. Forget I even mentioned it. But basically, it gives you a way to say, I want a database, I want a web server, here are the parameters I want, and it's done. Okay, so you don't have to think about, oh, I got to get a server, and I got to hook the server up to the network, and I got to get this, and I got to get that. And, you know, it's just, you don't worry about any of that. And that's a PaaS. Okay, now, next slide, please. So some PaaSes that you may have heard of, so making it a little bit more concrete. Cloud Foundry in many ways is kind of the grand old man of PaaSes, or at least PaaSes that are around today. And today a lot of people are using OpenShift. In the public cloud, you've got Google and Amazon and Microsoft. They all have their entries. And of course, there's Heroku and Force.com. You've got Stratos and other open source projects. So there's a lot of them out there. Next slide, please. All right, KaaS. So KaaS, Kubernetes as a Service, is a system that enables developers to deploy and or manage Kubernetes clusters in a self-service manner. The whole thing about this as a service is self-service manner. So KaaS allows you to basically go in and say, I want a Kubernetes cluster and I want it to have this many worker nodes, and I want them to be this size, and I want it to use this network, and click a button or call a API, and boom, and you know, in so many minutes it's done. And then your Kubernetes, you know, here's your kube config, go off, do your thing. Next slide, please. And so now Kubernetes as a service is a much newer category relative to PaaS, but there are still multiple KaaS products out there. You may have heard of Rancher and Platform 9, and Mirantis just announced its own KaaS a couple of months ago. And maybe a little less well-known VMware and Rackspace have their own. And then there are the public cloud versions from Amazon and Google and Microsoft. So there's a bunch out there. Okay. Now, how do you tell them apart? Now, if you've used any of these, you know that there is often a ton of overlap. OpenShift is based on Kubernetes, so it's often mistaken for KaaS, but it's really a PaaS. Rancher offers an application catalog, but it offers the ability to create new Kubernetes clusters and operate them independently. So it's really a KaaS. And in some ways, it doesn't really matter which is which. It's a matter of what you need and can the software you choose give it to you. So if we have to draw a line somewhere, basically, in this case, we're going to draw a line where on one side, on the KaaS side, we have, do you create Kubernetes clusters for developers to use? And on the other side, is your primary purpose to provide these components to developers for them to use? So that's where we're drawing the line. Okay, so now that we know what we're talking about, let's go ahead and talk about what makes each one of these special. So the primary, pardon me. So the primary feature of Platform as a Service, as I was saying, is of course that application catalog. This catalog enables users to create a project by basically hooking together different components rather than having to deploy them and confirm them, configure them individually. Some of these PaaSes may have dozens or even hundreds of components to choose from, which is great if you just want to put something together quickly. On the other hand, next slide, please. On the other hand, because PaaS assumes that you're only going to create applications by putting together those pre-provided components, that can also be a problem because you're locked into the applications and specifically the versions of the applications that are provided to you. For development, this may not matter. For production systems, this may be a much bigger deal. Also, you have to ask the question of whether these applications and versions are going to be supported and upgraded into the future. Now, what some companies do is they delete the existing catalog that comes with their PaaS and replace it with a catalog of production-approved applications. It's extra work, but you get the benefit of having the catalog without potentially exposing anything due to security issues. Next slide, please. Now, it's also simpler. So on the strength side, it's also simpler in many ways for developers because they don't really have to think too hard about what pieces to use. So, you need a database, you grab one. Of course, you could also think of this as a weakness because nobody thinks too hard about what they're linking together, but okay. Next slide, please. All right. Another strength from some perspectives is that a PaaS gives the operator a large amount of control. It's the operator who makes the architectural decisions for the PaaS, which in many ways makes decisions for the applications being built. It's the operator who does all the installation and maintenance and upgrading. It's the operator who also controls access to the PaaS. So that's great if you are an operator-centric organization. Next slide, please. On the other hand, if you are not an operator-centric organization, for example, if you've been leaning heavily into DevOps, this can be a problem. Developers who may be used to making a lot of decisions suddenly find that those decisions are not available to them. Next slide, please. So on the strength side, PaaS deployments typically have everything you need to get started. They have an existing application catalog, as we were saying, to which you can likely add components, and some of them will also have additional pieces, such as Jenkins or some other CI/CD or IAM for authentication, and so on. These may be built in or they may be bolted on. Next slide, please. On the other hand, maybe you don't want the pieces the PaaS has chosen for you. Maybe you want a different CI/CD system, or you want to use a different artifact repository. You're also dependent on how the people who built the PaaS decided that they should all fit together. If they didn't think about integrating with your systems, you're generally out of luck. But on the strength side, in today's world, usually a good thing that somebody's thinking about security, but because it's usually something that's handled as an afterthought by developers. And I'm a developer, I will cop to this. We don't usually think about that up front. And that's not a good thing. So a lot of these PaaS frameworks have various security decisions already made to help out in that respect. And you probably saw this coming, but that could also be a problem because you don't necessarily have any control over those security policies and restrictions. For example, I have been told that OpenShift doesn't let you use an image that must run as root, which sounds like a fantastic idea until you realize that that prevents you from running a very large number of images, including official images for some projects. Now, I'm not saying that's the right or the wrong thing. I'm just pointing out it's something that you may run into and have to work around. Okay, so that's platform as a service. Now, what about Kubernetes as a service? So let's go ahead and look at the pluses and minuses there. Okay. So as you probably guessed, where operators are kind of the last word in PaaS, KaaS gives more power to developers because KaaS just provides the way for you to spin up a cluster. It's up to the developer to decide what applications to run, when to upgrade or update their clusters, and so on. Now, some KaaSs provide an easy way to do that upgrading or updating, either through a GUI or an API call, or they might even have automated updates pushed to the clusters. But generally, it's also the developer who controls security, so you don't run into a situation where your developers are hamstrung by overly restrictive environments. And of course, there's always a flip side to that, especially if you're an operator who may be completely horrified at the idea of developers making all of those choices. They may be using applications that aren't approved, or creating cluster sprawl, or not updating their clusters. Though I should say, as I mentioned, again, some of these KaaSs do have automated updates built in. It's not as much of an issue, but, and also when it comes to security, it's unfortunate. Most developers are just not as versed in security as they probably should be. Okay, another good thing about Kubernetes as a service is that it makes scalability a little bit easier. And when you have a PaaS system, you typically have one large centralized system that everything runs on. And then if you need to scale horizontally, you need another big machine or three. On the other hand, if you have a small cluster running on small machines, you can just add some more of those small machines. So that's easier. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, you do have to watch for cluster sprawl. So, the fact that it's so easy to create a cluster means that you will probably have clusters just kind of floating around everywhere. Either taking up resources, or if you're in the public cloud, potentially running up bills. Okay. Another thing we alluded to earlier is the fact that developers can update or upgrade clusters themselves. But what that also means is that when a cluster is upgraded or updated, it's just that cluster that's affected. As opposed to PaaS, where potentially everything might be affected all at once if you're upgrading the centralized system. So another advantage of KaaS is that you're just using the KaaS to create or manage your cluster, and then the actual application is totally dependent on the Kubernetes API. So that means that you're not reliant on any particular non-Kubernetes API. For example, if you were to build your application using AWS Beanstalk or OpenShift or another PaaS, and you relied on the API of the PaaS for management, then you are effectively locked into that PaaS, because to move it, you would have to rewrite all of that management code, even if the core application code didn't use any of it. So that's kind of a real issue. But if you're using KaaS, you can move your app anytime, because it's self-contained within the cluster. So you can always move it to either another cluster or another provider. And that brings us to, next slide, please. Yes, and that brings us to maybe one of the biggest advantages, which is that you can create apps that span multiple clusters or even multiple clouds. Now, I'm not saying that this is impossible with PaaS. Okay, it's just more of a natural process with KaaS. I know you can do it with a PaaS. It's just a different process. So it's more natural to build your application on multiple clusters, and then you can move those clusters wherever you want. Most of the time, KaaS will even go ahead and create clusters for you on Kubernetes providers that have no idea that the KaaS exists. So this gets us a lot closer to cloud native here. Okay, so that is a lot of pluses and minuses, but how do you decide which one is right for you? Now, I obviously cannot tell you specifically one way or another for a lot of reasons. I mean, first off, of course, you know that every case is different, but also every PaaS and KaaS are different too. So you need to ask yourself some questions and then look at the specific product you're considering to see whether it does what you need it to do. Okay, so let's look at some of those questions. First thing you need to think about is to decide what you're trying to accomplish in the first place. Do you already have applications and you're just focusing on deployment? You know, PaaS might not be right for you in that case. You're probably looking for more of a KaaS. On the other hand, if you are coming at this more of a greenfield thing, maybe PaaS sounds like a better idea. Next slide, please. On the other hand, if you are dealing with developers who maybe need more help in getting things set up, then you're more likely to want a PaaS. Maybe you have specific applications that you would like them to use. Now, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to go with PaaS, because you could use a KaaS, but a KaaS that has a robust, say, image directory that you're going to require your developers to pull from. So you got to weigh these things. This is why I'm saying, figure out what your requirements are, look at the specific product, and these are the things that you need to take into consideration. Next slide, please. Now, on the other hand, if your developers are more savvy and want more control over their actual Kubernetes cluster, maybe you need KaaS, or at least a PaaS that enables them to have their own cluster, which not all of them do. Some of them do, not all of them. Next slide, please. So while we're talking about that, how many tenants and applications are you looking at? If you're talking about hundreds or thousands of tenants and applications, you probably don't want a system that puts everything in one big cluster with separation using namespaces, just because it's I'm not an operator, but that seems to me like a management nightmare. Next slide, please. Flexibility is another issue. Do you have internal systems you want to tie into? Are you married to a specific networking infrastructure? These are things that you need to consider, because you need to make sure that whatever system you choose enables you to do what it is that you need to do. Next slide, please. Same thing for multi-cluster or multi-cloud apps. If there's even a chance that you may need to move to another provider at some point, you need to make sure that that's possible. And these days, most apps are multi-cluster in some form. So that is a really big deal. The days of the monolithic application are, well, I don't think they're over, but they're definitely numbered. And especially with edge computing coming out and coming into its own. I shouldn't say coming out, but coming into its own. You really need to take that seriously. I guess what it comes down to is the question of how predictable are your plans? Where do you think you may need flexibility in the future? And you need to make sure that that flexibility is there. Okay. Okay. So that's a lot of little details. So I would encourage you to go ahead and download the comparison table to get a feel for what products are going to give you what capabilities. Because like I said, there are a bunch of things that I didn't even talk about. Can you deploy on bare metal? And how long does it take to deploy? And, how is multi-tenancy handled and stuff like that? What kind of ingress is, there's a lot of stuff. So I would encourage you to go ahead and grab that spreadsheet. All right, so I guess that we can now go ahead and move on to questions. So let's see. So if you can drop your questions in the Q&A, I know a couple people have dropped them into the chat. I just want to make sure that we don't miss anything. Yes. So, all right. Awesome. Wow. Okay. So let's see. We've got a couple things going on here. Let me see. Can you talk more about why you consider OpenShift to be more of a PaaS than a KaaS? All right, let me preface this by saying that I am not an expert in OpenShift, and that most of my experience with OpenShift has been OpenShift 3, which is not the most recent version, and that OpenShift 4 does make a lot of kind of KaaS-y changes. So some of the things that I'm going to say may not apply to OpenShift 4. However, OpenShift, to my understanding, was designed to be more of a PaaS. It was designed to provide these, I want to say they were originally called cartridges, but I may be thinking of something else. I'm pretty sure they were cartridges. It was designed to provide that functionality in terms of, giving people this ability to use this functionality. In fact, OpenShift wasn't originally even Kubernetes, but Red Hat realized that that was where things were going and that they needed to move to Kubernetes, and God bless them for doing that. but at least as recently as OpenShift 3, it was basically one giant Kubernetes cluster that had a sort of OpenShift wrapper around it. You could not deploy a new cluster. You could only put things into the existing cluster. So that is why I put OpenShift firmly in the PaaS category. Okay, I hope that answers that question. Let's see here. I'm just kind of running through. Someone has made a comment that OpenShift motivations are basically SDN and CI/CD, and Kubernetes was an afterthought. And I think that that's probably fair. And it's not meant to be a derisive comment at all. It was meant to make these things easier, and it does. But that puts it in the PaaS category. Okay. In terms of adoption, do we see more KaaS compared to PaaS? I think it's too early to say. PaaS has been around for what, 10, 15 years, maybe longer. And KaaS is really just the last couple of years. I think that KaaS is definitely going to be exploding in the next couple of years based on the fact that Kubernetes is exploding and people need to be able to use it. So I would definitely say that KaaS is something to watch out for. All right, let's see. If the applications are written for AKS or EKS or PKS, that will also have a locking with the respective provider APIs. Anytime you are using provider APIs as opposed to the Kubernetes API, you are locking into that provider. That is sort of the definition, and in fact, that is part of the reason why these providers give you those APIs. I mean, think about it for a minute. If you're Amazon and you have a great thing to allow people to do with Kubernetes, you have two choices. You can build it and contribute it to the Kubernetes community so that anybody using Kubernetes can use it, or you can make your own API and make it available, but then anybody who wants to use it has to use it on Amazon. So, and not just Amazon. I'm not singling out Amazon. I'm just using that as an example. So anytime that you are using a provider-specific API, you are locking your application to that specific provider. Okay. In the PDF, I assume the PDF that you have downloaded. In the PDF, you list pivotals, PKS, but not PCF. I thought PKS was still in beta. Can you speak where PCF fits in? It's clearly non-Kubernetes PaaS, but is there anything more to add? Whew. Well, I think what I'm going to say there is that spreadsheet is going to be updated as we add more systems to it. And I will make note that we want to add PCF in there. I'm not versed enough in PCF to comment on it sort of extemporaneously, but I will make sure that we add it in there. Let's see here. Christoph Henry, I apologize, but I actually do not know whether that really is a convergence between PaaS and KaaS. And he knows what he asked. All right. Let's see here. Does KaaS provision nodes across a cluster or even multiple pods in a node? Okay, so I think we need to make the distinction between provisioning Kubernetes and provisioning an application on Kubernetes. Okay, so what KaaS does is it provisions the actual Kubernetes cluster. So KaaS starts out with empty hardware nodes. Well, not empty, they presumably have an operating system on them. Well, I guess they don't have to, but they probably usually do. And so you start there with blank nodes, and you end up with an empty cluster spread across as many nodes as you have set. So, for example, if I'm using Mirantis KaaS and I say I want to deploy a cluster with three controller nodes and 6 worker nodes, then the KaaS will go ahead and deploy that cluster over those multiple nodes. Nodes in this case being physical machines. Now, when it's done, what I've got is an empty Kubernetes cluster with no applications, no pods on it, except the ones to normally run it. But then when I'm going to provision the application, that's when the normal Kubernetes scheduler comes into play. Now, if you have a PaaS or a KaaS that has an application catalog, for example, I was mentioning some of the KaaSs do have application catalogs. They may go ahead and spread those pods over multiple nodes that have been provisioned by the KaaS. I know it's kind of a little bit of Kubernetes inception here, but yeah. So that is how that works. All right, let's see what else we've got here. I'm just kind of looking through. In my opinion, what is more cost effective? Yeah, that is impossible to answer because there are just too many variables. However, I will say that would be a good topic for a TCO calculator. I just published an article on TCO assumptions, and there are so many things that you have to think about because it's a matter of resources. Are they public cloud? Are they private cloud? If they're private cloud, what do you have to pay for electricity and cooling and your admins? And if it's public cloud, you still need admins to help your internal people and to manage everything else there. So there's just too many variables. But you do have to take all of those things into consideration when you are deciding. I know there's a couple more questions. Are there open source KaaS solutions out there, or do most people resort to Ansible or kubeadmin automation to stand up their clusters? This may only be relevant to organizations that run Kubernetes on-prem. Yeah, I think it is probably only relevant to them. And I think that at that point you have to ask yourself what you consider to be where do you draw the line between an installer and a KaaS? Because if you just want something to install Kubernetes, yeah, I mean, you've got Minikube, we've got, there's a ton of open source installers that that will help you do that, but they don't necessarily manage multiple clusters. And that, I think, is the line between installer and KaaS. As far as whether there are open source KaaSs out there, yeah, I'm not really sure, but that's a good question, and I think I would like to answer that in a follow-up blog. Also, that other question about Cloud Foundry, I would like to answer in a follow-up blog. So I'm gonna put that one in my pocket and get back to you on that one. Let's see. I know I had a couple more. Hold on, let me get to them. Is it possible to have a PaaS that's also a KaaS? Yeah, certainly. In fact, we're saying, OpenShift probably does both at this point, at least in OpenShift 4, but I don't know this for sure. Like I said, most of my experience is with 3. But there's no reason that a PaaS could not deploy Kubernetes clusters as if they were other applications. And again, there's no reason a KaaS can't offer you an application catalog, and a lot of them do. Can you deploy a PaaS on Kubernetes? Yeah, sure. I mean, a PaaS is a software application. So, there's no reason you can't deploy it on Kubernetes. You can deploy it on OpenShift, on OpenStack. You can, deploy it on anything. I have a question here from Ben Silverman. Tell me more about Mirantis' new KaaS. Tell me how cool it was to work with Ben Silverman when he worked at Mirantis. I hear he's a diva. Yes, Ben, I hear he's a diva too. Anyway, yes, Mirantis does have its own KaaS coming out. If you want to be involved in the private beta, certainly let me know, and chase@mirantis.com. That is fine. Let's see what other questions we have. We do have some more time, so if you have any more questions, please go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. And if not, I think we are going to give you back the next 14 minutes of your life. Taylor, what do you think?
Sounds good to me. Thanks so much, Nick, for a great presentation. Oh, we have a last minute question.
Oh, we do. Does OpenShift support KubeSpray? Oh God, I don't know the answer to that one. That'll go in the follow-up. We'll grab all these questions and we'll put them in the follow-up blog because I have no idea, but I will find out for you specifically, just for you. Okay. I do want to thank everybody for putting up with my rambling.
Yes, thanks so much, everybody. And thank you, Nick. That was great.
Thank you, Taylor.
Of course, the webinar recording and the slides will be online later today at cncf.io. And we look forward to seeing you all at a future CNCF webinar. Have a great day, everybody.